This reading was brought to you by the Ministry of Image. With a focus on high-quality hardcover prints, the Ministry of Image brings your favorite fan fictions to your doorstep. They have provided me with a hardcover copy of the book Tales of the Sun to read to you all, and then give away at the end. To hear more about them and the upcoming giveaway, stay tuned to the end of the reading.
Memory, the day we surprised her. "Thank you very much, Mr. Goldleaf," I said grandly. I tucked away the big, old-fashioned key he'd given me in my bags. Old Mr. Goldleaf huffed a little at me. "Young lady," he said a little too loudly, "I don't mind you taking over my library for the evening, but please don't rearrange the books." "Wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Goldleaf," I said. "I don't mean to imply you're irresponsible," he continued as if he hadn't heard me, which, now that I think about it, he probably hadn't. "But it takes me hours every day to put back all the books these young whippersnappers leave out of place." He gestured angrily. "They just throw them around like they own the place. Got no respect for the Dewey Decimal System. That's what's wrong with this generation." I smiled a little, then looked around as old Mr. Goldleaf continued to rant. We stood on the main floor of the Golden Oaks Library, the air filled with the scent of dust and age. I wasn't much for reading myself, and the library was almost depressingly small, but it was a library, and a government building to boot. Treehouse? Government treehouse. In either case, one of the perks of my position is that I had free run of any government buildings, be they inside a tree or no, which meant that when I was looking for somewhere fun and exciting to stay while in Ponyville for the Summer Sun celebration and happened to stumble across the detail that the library had discussed, apartment of a second floor, I knew exactly where I would be staying. That was the other reason I'd given Twilight that long list of errands to run, so I could get here first and spend some time getting it ready for the two of us. But first, I had to get rid of Goldleaf, who was still going on about foals these days, and was somehow oblivious to the fact that one of said foals was standing directly in front of him, patiently waiting for him to finish. I continued, listening with half an ear until he shifted from ranting about foals these days to what's wrong with the government, at which point I realized that he was going to be a while. Yes, I said, raising my voice. "I'm sure that you're right. After all, you have thought long and hard about these things." Mr. Goldleaf finally shut up, then looked up at me owlishly through his eyeglasses. It seemed that, for just a second, he'd forgotten I was even there. Nevertheless, I took him by the hoof and started walking him toward the door. "I'm sure our palace analysts could use the opinions of someone so wise and philosophical as yourself," I said, tugging him along. "But it really is getting late. It's almost 5:30 already. Why don't you get along home to your wife and we can talk about this tomorrow, He puffed out his chest a little. "Why, of course, young lady," he said, "and it's wonderful to find that there's someone out there who's—" Of course, I said, cutting him off. "Now run along home, and I'll take good care of the books for you. No one will dare disrespect Mr. Decimal on my watch." By now, we were at the door. I held it open for him, and he almost pranced out of it into the midsummer air. "I have every confidence he will," he said, "and I shall—" I smiled at him, then shut the door before he could get started again. I quickly drew the key from my bags, locked the door, sagged against it, and sighed. I tossed the key in the air, caught it again, set it on top of a nearby shelf, and trotted upstairs. I pushed open the door to the apartment, poked my head inside, and stared. After a minute, I let out a low whistle, then walked the rest of the way in. They hadn't been lying. There was an apartment up in here for the second floor, with a bathroom and a kitchenette and everything, but they hadn't mentioned it was so tiny. I probably could have fit the whole thing inside my bedroom twice over. Nor did they mention that. Apparently, Mr. Goldleaf had been using the space as his own private break room. In the center of the floor stood a card table with a couple of mismatched folding chairs around it. A coffee maker sat on the counter next to the sink, surrounded by a little flock of coffee stains. A stack of cardboard boxes stood in one corner, and I could already see the cobwebs from here. And, of course, every flat surface was covered in crumbs. I stared for a moment. then cracked a grin. I had to admit this was unexpected, but all it really needed was a little elbow grease. Plus, I had another hour or two before Twy was supposed to be home, so I had time. I fished a scrunchie from my bag, then drew up my mane back in a ponytail. As I snapped the scrunchie in place, I looked around for the broom. About half an hour later, right as I was deciding where to stash the card table, the door downstairs clicked open. I brightened, then skipped to the door of the apartment. I swung it open, eager to greet Twilight, but froze. The first thing I noticed was that the key to the door was where I had left it, on top of the bookshelf by the door. The second thing I noticed was the pink pony staring guiltily up at me. She looked rather young and had a light pink coat with an absurdly curly mane. She wore saddlebags already stuffed to bursting, and the small cart she'd parked outside groaned under the weight of its contents. In her mouth, she held a metal ring, with several thin pieces of twisted metal dangling from it. "Can I help you?" I asked slowly. She flashed a bright, almost blinding grin at me, somehow making the lockpicks vanish as she did. "Are you the princess?" she asked eagerly. "I am," I said. The little mare grinned wider. It was, if that even was possible, and bounced towards the stairs. "I'm Pinkie Pie," she beamed, "but you can call me Pinkie." "Well, Pinkie," I said, "care tell me what exactly you're doing here tonight?" "Throwing a surprise party," she cried. "A surprise party?" "Yep, for my new bestest friend, Twilight Sparkle." I raised an eyebrow. "So you've met then?" I asked. "Sorta," she admitted. "We passed in the street." "And that's enough to make you want to throw a party for her?" I asked. "A surprise party," she corrected, "to welcome her to Ponyville. I do it for everyone who's new to town. I would have thrown one for you too," she added, "if I knew you were staying overnight." "Does that mean she picks every pony else's locks too?" "Are you Ponyville's welcoming committee then?" I asked aloud. "Not officially," she said. "Just want to make sure every pony feels welcome, and that they meet a whole bunch of other ponies on their first day here. Everyone needs a friend in new town after all." I felt a little smile creep across my face. Her enthusiasm was positively infectious, plus the prospect of helping Twilight meet more ponies. "You want any help?" I asked. She stared at me for a second, then broke into her bright, sunshiny grin again. I was helping her hang streamers when she asked me the question. I had already taped one end of the streamer to the ceiling with my magic and was trying to judge where to hang the other end, when Pinkie looked up from the balloon she was tying. "So," she said as if we were already in the middle of our conversation, "what's it like being princess?" I looked over at her, then turned back to the streamer. "That's kind of a big question," I said. "Anything in particular you're wondering?" "Oh, lots," she said offhandedly. "Like, what's it like moving the sun?" I snorted. "I don't think you'd understand," I said, glancing up at the empty space in the middle of her forehead. "No offense, it's just that you're a caring individual who wants to understand the lives of her friends," she said without skipping a beat. "Try me." I raised an eyebrow. Didn't take her long to make friends, apparently. "Well," I said slowly, "it's actually not that hard, to be honest. The sunstone does most of the work. I just kinda need to fire it up and make sure the sun moves in the right direction." "Do you have to set the sun too?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nah, momentum takes care of that. I just got a raise in the morning is all." She nodded. "And what's with the season changes?" she asked. "The days get shorter, and it gets colder. Do you have to schedule or something?" I blew out a long, slow breath. Don't ask me, I thought to myself. I didn't exactly ace my astrophysics course after all. "Not sure," I admitted. "I always start raising the sun at the same time, but something about seasons makes it move faster or slower. I think it has something to do with the stone itself." Pinkie nodded, then grabbed another balloon and started to blow it up. "It takes a lot out of you," I admitted. "Raising the sun, I mean. Especially the summer sun celebration. But," I shrugged, "I've kinda got used to it. Hardest part is still the moon, of course." Pinkie looked up at me. "What's the moon got to do with it?" "Well," I said slowly, "I'm in charge of the sun, but the moon's gotta move too, and sometimes when I move the sun, it gets a lot harder suddenly." I scratched my head. "I think the sun kinda pushes the moon along a little." Pinky shrugged. Makes sense. She said, so what else do you do when you're not raising the sun? Oh, you know, the usual, school, homework, that sort of stuff. Any other princessing you get to do? Not really. I have ponies take care of almost everything. All I have to do is hold court twice a week in the afternoons and rubber stamp anything big that someone wants me to do. My mom set it up that way before she died. Pinky glanced up at me, then nodded. Sounds easy, she said. I looked over at her. She was fishing another balloon out of the pile. I didn't have the heart to argue with her, plus I wasn't sure she'd understand. She didn't know what it was like. Everyone expecting you to have all the answers all the time. Everyone treating you like you were different somehow, just because your mom willed you a piece of jewelry and then died. Sorta, I admitted. I stuck the other end of the streamer over a window. It wasn't even, but I wasn't sure I cared anymore. So, I said, trying to force some enthusiasm in my voice. Well, I was coming for the shindig. Surprise party, she corrected me. Not a shindig. Whole different can of spaghetti. She looked up at me and smiled. I've invited practically everyone, she said, including some very, very dear friends of mine. Her eyes glittered. You'll love these ponies. There's Rainbow Dash, who likes to play tough, but is really a pushover, and Fluttershy, who's so timid she really is scared of her own shadow sometimes. And then there's Rarity, who... Interlude for a jazz ensemble. Tuxedo Junction. All of us sat quietly as Twilight walked across the lobby of the Carousel Boutique, then started up the stairs. As soon as the door swung shut behind her, Pinky leaned towards me, her eyes glittering. So Cece, she said, grinning, dish. I glanced around the group. Rainbow Dash looked bored. Applejack watched me curiously. Fluttershy was pretending not to listen, and Pinky waited eagerly for me to spill my guts. I grinned. I'd forgotten just how much I'd missed these ponies. The past few days had been rather uneventful, truth be told. Luna had been giving me the silent treatment more than anything, which was always better than the alternative, and I was very much looking forward to spending a week without having to deal with her, on either a personal or professional level. We'd arrived in Ponyville on Sunday night, and checked into the 2 suites we'd reserved in the hotel. I would have snuck out right then to go see Twilight, but Luna took a seat by the fire, with her front door hanging wide open, and pulled out her sewing. From where she sat, she had a clear view of my door, and I couldn't figure out a way to sneak out without her noticing. I spent so long waiting for her to go to bed that I fell asleep myself. The next morning, Luna put on a pith helmet and matching khaki blouse and skirt, then disappeared into the forest. I, on the other hoof, spent all day shaking hooves and kissing babies. As much as I hated to admit it, I could tell I was already on thin ice with Luna, so I had to put in my due diligence. Had to show that I could be the princess she wanted if I cared enough. But, you bet your hooves, the second mare clocked out for the day, I was practically pounding down Twilight's door. She must have been waiting for me, because she opened it immediately. She smiled at me, and then we just hugged each other for a few long minutes. I missed you, I said, my voice thick. Me too, but you're here, for now at least. Half an hour later, the others started showing up, and we had a bit of a party. I ordered pizza on the Royal Expense account. Rainbow tried to convince Rarity to go get a couple of 6-packs for all of us, and Pinky insisted we play at least one round of Pin the Tail on the pony. It very nearly turned into a full-blown slumber party, until I mentioned that Luna would crucify me if I wasn't back in the suite at a reasonable hour. I had dropped enough hints that something big had been going on at the palace, and 1 or 2 of them even asked for details, but we all knew how Twilight felt about her grandmother, equal parts profound respect and abject terror, so I just told them not now, maybe tomorrow. And now tomorrow was here. Today, Tuesday, was my only real obligation of the week. That afternoon, after everyone got out of school, we had an appointment to drop by Rarity's and see what she'd done with our gala dresses. And she'd said she might even schedule a fashion show for us on Thursday or Friday, if things went well. After we all arrived, she started bringing us up on the workroom one at a time to keep our measurements confidential or something. Everyone had gone except Twilight and me, and I could tell that the anticipation of what I had to say was killing the rest of them. And at last, Rarity had called Twilight up, and now, with her out of the room, I could finally tell them just how evil Luna had been to me. And so, as Pinky put it, I dished. I told them what I was like living with Luna. I told them how cruel and petty she was. I told them how hard she rode me, how much she hated when I even looked at her sideways. In short, I gave them a guided tour of the special sort of hell my life has become since that fateful morning in June, when everything had turned upside down. When I finished, no one spoke for several seconds. "Damn," Rainbow Dash said finally. "Almost makes you wish we just finished her off when we'd had the chance." "Rainbow Dash," Fluttershy cried, that's so mean." "Why?" said Rainbow. "It's true." "That might be taking it a little far, Dash," AJ admitted. "But the princess sure doesn't sound like she's taking pains to be civil, neither." "That's the frustrating part," I interjected. "She's obsessed with civility and respect, but whenever it comes to me, she just—" "A total party pooper?" Pinky offered, giggling. "Pretty much," I said. "I mean, I don't know what's wrong. I get good grades. Decent." Fluttershy corrected me. "Decent," I admitted, which I think is pretty good considering I have to get up at 5 every morning to raise the sun and do well in school and deal with her nonsense. Suddenly, the door to the stairway opened. We all looked up. Twilight stepped through the door and walked quickly toward us, heading down and squeezed into an empty spot on the sofa between Applejack and Fluttershy. A moment later, Rarity staggered into the doorway. I swallowed, haggard. There wasn't really any other word for her look. Her mane was disheveled, her glasses askew, and her yellow measuring tape hung limply around her neck. As she leaned on the doorframe, she reminded me of nothing so much as a painting I'd seen once, a medieval portrait of some queen or other being led to the execution with a rope around her neck, a look of defeated resignation on her face. "Cease," Rarity said simply. "You're next." I swallowed, then stood. I paced across the floor and ducked inside the doorway, squeezing past Rarity to fit in. I climbed the steps, then let myself into the workroom. Rarity's workroom was circular, much like the rest of the boutique. Sketches and fabric swatches were pinned against every wall and fell across much of the floor. Against one wall stood Rarity's sewing machine, a hoof-pedaled antique, with several baskets of thread on the floor beside it. Against the opposite wall stood Rarity's bed, more patterns and fabric swatches scattered on top of it like autumn leaves. I'd been in here once or twice before, and it had always been a place of cheerful disorder, the sort of mythological chaos that gave birth to creation. But today, a pallor hung around the room. Something was wrong. Rarity appeared at my side and led me silently to one side of the room, where stood 7 dress forms, each draped in a pale white sheet. Poking out from under the wrappings, I could see green and navy and pink and rainbow stripes. Rarity lit her horn and pulled one of the dress forms away from the wall, then whipped off the sheet. The dummy wore a half-finished dress held together with big, hasty stitches, the cloth in shades of maroon and salmon and burgundy. "I've only done the preliminary sketches," she said, her voice filled with brittle saccharine enthusiasm. "But I am quite pleased with this design." She lifted a sheet of paper from the desk, then carried it back to me. "The swatches aren't final. Just wanted to give the idea of what the colors will look like when it's finished." She handed me the sheet of paper, then took a deep breath. "Please," she said with an air of someone pronouncing their own doom, "let me know if you'd like any changes." And then she braced herself. It wasn't her dramatic motion by any means, but she drew back an inch or two, turned her head slightly, a bit in her lip. It looked like she almost was waiting for me to physically strike her. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned my eyes to the sketch. I studied it for several moments, eyed the cloth on the dress, then turned back to the sketch again. "So, what do you think?" Rarity asked, breaking the silence. I jumped a little. "It's not too much, is it?" She added a faint note of hope in her voice. "No," I replied hesitantly. "It's beautiful, it's just—" Rarity, her shoulders sagged. "Not what you wanted," she finished. "Well, you can be honest. Everyone else has been already." I bit my lip, then nodded. Rarity sighed and snatched the sketch away from me. "That's fine," she said in a voice that very clearly indicated it was not fine. "What did you want?" "It really is nice," I offered. "It's just, I was hoping for something—" I hesitated. "Something more plain," I finished. I glanced at Rarity. She looked exhausted, too tired to even be irritated with me. Plain, she repeated. I nodded, but not ugly. I quickly added, just something ordinary. Ordinary, she repeated. Like a moth. At this, she looked up at me. Like a moth? What do you mean, like a moth? I gestured vaguely. Like a moth. Pretty when you see it, but not something that stands out, really. You have to look for it, and even then you might miss it. She looked up at me over her glasses. Cece, she said warily, are you asking me for a camouflage gown? Because I can do it. That's not even the craziest request I've gotten today. No, I replied quickly. No, just something pretty, but not something that stands out. I scratched the back of my head nervously. Does that make sense? Rarity watched me for a moment. Perhaps. Let me see what I can do. I nodded eagerly. Thanks, Rarity. You're the best. Rarity wearily threw the sheet back over the dress form, then pushed it back in line. I got the distinct impression that it was time for me to go. I turned and quickly slipped out of the room. On my way back down the stairs, I noticed a sick, sinking feeling in my stomach, like somehow I had said some wrong thing. Though where exactly I had gone wrong, I couldn't say. Rarity's look still haunted me that evening as Twilight and I sat in my suite in the Ponyville Hotel. We sat quietly doing homework, while Philomena, perched on the wardrobe, preened herself. It wasn't how I wanted to spend my vacation, but it was part of the deal, and I wasn't going to say no to princess-mandated time with Twilight. I stared down at my textbook. 14a, integrate f prime of x equals the sum of the square root of x times 7x squared plus 6 quantity divided by 2. After a few minutes of silence, I looked up. But she offered, right? I said. To alter those dresses, I mean. Twilight nodded. She did offer. Insisted, even. I nodded sullenly, then looked back at my math. After a few seconds, I scoffed and threw down my pencil. I held out one arm and clicked my tongue. With an elegant swoosh, Philomena swooped in and landed on my arm. She hopped up towards my shoulder and nuzzled me under the chin. I smiled and nuzzled her back. I hadn't planned on bringing her, but as soon as I realized doing so would irritate Luna, I'd insisted. But even so, it was nice to have her along. She didn't do much to help the pit in my stomach, though. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Twilight glance up at me over her glasses. Taking a break, I called. Those are allowed. You said so. Twilight returned to her work without comment. Who's my good girl? I said, nuzzling Philomena again. You are. Yes, you are. And suddenly Philomena coughed. One long red plume dropped from her wing and fluttered to the floor. I looked sharply at her, and she looked back at me with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. I thought for a second, then grinned wickedly. Hey, Twi, I said, looking up. Fluttershy. She's good with animals, right? Twilight looked up, then nodded slowly. Does she have any experience with... I grabbed a loose feather and held it up. Phoenixes? Twilight stared blankly at me for a moment, then her eyes went wide. No, she said, dropping her pencil. That's not a good idea. Oh, come on. It's just a little prank. Maybe it'll give us a laugh, help us all feel a little better. Cease, please, Twilight said, standing. You don't know her like I do, and I'm telling you... Oh, come on, I said. What's the worst that can happen? Memory. The day she appeared. Nightmare Moon howled in rage as the rainbow magic slammed into her. She dropped my petrol, and it bounced and rolled to a stop at the top of the stone platform. I snatched it up from where it lay, clapped it around my neck, and slid the pin into place. Instantly, I felt the power course through my body and up my wing feathers. I planted my hooves and spread my wings, and it happened. To this day, I'm still not entirely certain what it was. It felt a little like the summer sun celebration, I guess. The sunstone grew hot against my chest, and its power flowed through my horn. But instead of moving the sun, the magic shot out and combined with the rainbow, adding a blazing white streak. I shot at Nightmare Moon, and she screamed. And suddenly, it was over. The light faded, and the daze was empty before us. I stared in silence for a heartbeat. Then I squealed. "We did it!" I shrieked. I ran over to Twilight, who stood there, glasses askew, swaying on her hooves, her tiara with the pink stone still smoking gently. I swept her up in a hug and danced around with her. After a moment, she smiled crookedly and hugged me back. Soon, her friends dived in for a group hug and we collapsed, laughing in a heap on the floor. "That was awesome, Cece," cried Pinky. "You were all awesome," I cried back. "If you hadn't distracted her..." Twilight pushed her glasses up her nose. "I don't get it, though," she said. "I don't think we did it right. The prophecy said sun and moon and stars, but all we had was sun." "Prophecy schmomphacy," Rainbow interrupted. "We killed her, didn't we? That was the important part." Suddenly, we all stopped laughing and looked up at the ruin of the dais in silence. We could hear something very clearly, a frightened, whimpering murmur. Twilight wriggled out from the bottom of the pony pile, then tip-hoofed closer. "Twilight, don't," called Fluttershy. Twilight stopped, then turned back to us to look at me, with wide, frightened eyes. Pinkie Pie and Fluttershy clambered off my back, and I stood. I stepped closer, and as I walked up beside Twilight, the murmur resolved into words, a babbling of stream of words. "I do so apologize. I didn't mean to inconvenience. I shan't do it again." In the center of the dais, where Nightmare Moon had stood less than a minute ago, was a shallow crater burned black. Inside the crater, lying in a small pile, were broken shards of armor and tattered black feathers. And in the center of the wreckage lay a mare, babbling like a fool. She lay on the floor, covering her eyes with her hooves. Her mane fell about her in steely blue curtain, her coat a deep inky blue. She was ancient. "Who in Tartarus is..." I began, but then I saw it. She had both wings and a horn. Whoever she was a princess. Twilight bowed. I looked sharply at her, then quickly bobbed my head. Something about the motion caught the mare's attention. She stopped her babbling, then looked up. She looked at me first, opened her mouth, and closed it again. She stared at me with a distant, unfocused look Twi had when she couldn't find her glasses. She must have been blind as a bat, this one. We locked gazes for several seconds. Her expression remained distant and frightened. Finally, she tore her gaze away from me and turned to Twilight. As soon as she laid eyes on her, she froze. "Celine?" she breathed. Twilight and I looked at each other. "Celine, my darling, my daughter," she said, standing unsteadily. What are you doing here?" Twilight sucked in a gasp, then looked at me, her eyes wide and frightened. I stared at her blankly, then turned back to the mare. She was staring at Twilight eagerly, her legs wobbling, but as I watched her, her face began to fall. She turned to me, a question, unspoken on her lips. I looked between the two of them, uncertain of what to say. And suddenly, the stranger started to cry. Orchestra Suite Number 1, Dance of the Firebird. "And once again," Aunt Luna growled, "we find ourselves having this discussion." The three of us, Great Aunt Luna, Twilight, and I, stood in Looney's suite just across the hall from mine. I had promised myself I could make it to Sunday without getting into a fight with Looney, but here it was, only Thursday night, and she already looked like she was ready to tear my throat out. I watched Looney pace the room, wearing nothing but her pachel, her khakis laid draped over her armchair, her pith helmet perched on top, both covered in ash. I snuck a glance at Luna. She stood beside me, head bowed, looking properly ashamed. Her glasses were crooked on her face, and she had ash in her mane. I probably did too. But there were more important things to stake at this moment. I turned to look at Luna again, mustering a most defiant glare. Suddenly, Aunt Luna stopped, then turned to glower at me. "Princess Celestia," she said gravely. "My name is Cece." Looney's eyes flashed. "I will not call you by such a ridiculous nickname," she snapped. "You are a princess, not a child." "And why do you keep treating me like one?" I shot back. "Because you insist on being childish," she snarled. "On top of all your other mischief today, you had the gall to—" She stopped, sighed, and put a hoof to her forehead. After a moment, she spoke again, quieter. "I cannot rightly apprehend," she said slowly, what exactly you were hoping to accomplish by giving your friend Fluttershy, Twilight interjected quietly. Luna nodded her thanks. Fluttershy, she repeated. You gave your friend Fluttershy your dear Philomena to take care of on the eve of her rebirth, claiming her to be gravely ill. If you weren't trying to break her heart, then I have no idea. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, I pleaded. It was just supposed to be a simple prank. Philomena always rebirths about an hour after she molts. How was I supposed to know she was going to hold on for another 48? Luna shot me a scathing look. Would it have hurt Fluttershy any less? She said icily. If it had happened sooner. Yes, I growled, but even to me the words sounded hollow. Luna smirked a little, and I snarled back. We both knew the score. Looney 1, CC 0. Luna took a deep breath. Prank, trick, or outright lie, she began. There's little difference in the end. But be that as it may, your actions against Fluttershy were bad enough on their own. But the impact they had on Rarity was simply disgraceful. Poor Fluttershy was so distressed that she missed Rarity's fashion show, jeopardizing the whole endeavor further. She added, building up steam. Fluttershy rushed the stage in the middle of the show, scattering Philomena's ashes all over everyone and everything present, especially on all of Rarity's hard work. Her eyes flashed again, to say nothing of the fact that you took shameful advantage of Rarity's generosity. She volunteered, I cried out. She wanted to make us dresses. You have no right, and you have no right, Luna roared. Grandmother? Twilight said quietly. Both of us stopped and turned to look at her. I shot Luna a glance. Buried somewhere deep under the ice in her steel gaze, I caught the faintest glimmer of warmth. I huffed indignantly. Grandmother, Twilight repeated. I know it may not have been right to snub her work like she did. She pushed her glasses up her nose. But Rarity was only trying to make sure we were happy with her gifts, that's all. I understand that, Twilight, Luna said gently, and I can appreciate the instinct. However, she added, turning to me again, be that as it may, that does not give you license to abuse her generosity like you did. She made each of you beautiful dresses, and you just— Mine was awful, I cried out. Did you see it? Luna turned and shot me a withering glare. I did, she said. I stared back at her blankly. You did? She nodded. She asked my advice, she admitted. I have something of a reputation as a seamstress, and she wanted to know what colors I would recommend. And I was the one who suggested she use that beautiful burgundy. I glared at her. So it's your ego talking then, I hissed. She glared right back. My ego has nothing to do with it, she said. You could have worn a pillowcase and I would have been happy for you, if only it had been honestly given and graciously received. And were it, you very nearly did, she added with a disdainful sniff. In all earnest, your dress was a travesty, gray and shapeless. You looked almost like some feral mustang that had stumbled. I looked normal, I roared. I don't want to be some figurehead to be admired. I want to be like everyone else. I want to be able to live my life the way I wanted and not have anyone try to make me be someone I'm not. In the sudden, ringing silence, Luna's gaze hardened. She lowered her head and stared directly into my eyes. I shrank back, but I could not tear my gaze away from hers. Princess Celestia, she said slowly, since the moment you took the Patrol, you have been nothing like everyone else. Now you are a princess. That means your life is not your own, and that you will never be normal again. My gut twisted, and I felt my wings hanging hot and heavy by my side. You had best make peace with that fact. And then I raised her head again. The sooner, the better. Looney 2, CC 0. Looney slowly straightened up, watching my expression. I glared back, counting the ways I wish I could make her suffer. After a moment, Luna sighed. Very well. If you insist on being defiant, then you are hereby barred from attending the Grand Galloping Gala. What? Grandmother, Twilight cut in, I don't think— Luna stood a little taller, glaring down at me. You do not appreciate the gravity of your situation, Your Highness, she said, her tones dripping acid. If you insist on kicking against the spurs, then one must make them too costly to kick. And since it seems the only thing you care about is spending time with your friends, she spat, then it is most obvious screw to turn. But you can't, I cried. Rarity, the dresses, I can't. Can I? Luna crowed. Well then, the answer is simple. She sneered down at me. Fall in line. She spat. Fall in... Luna grinned wickedly. Ever since I returned, you have done nothing but destroy your own position. Your subjects have no respect for you. Your guards have no loyalty. And if you insist on going down this path, Equestria will burn. Her eyes glittered. So, if you really do want to be like everyone else, prove it and renounce the Patrol. Twilight let out a little gasp, and I stared at Looney in frank astonishment. She simply gazed back at me with a smug grin on her face. Since you appear unable to offer even that courtesy, the choice is simple. Either cease this nonsense and act like a princess should, or I will be forced to remove your temptations to misbehave. She stood there staring at me, and I felt a fire building in my chest. Who was she to... What made her think she could just... Luna turned away, then stepped to where her dress lay. She picked up her helmet and dusted it off. If that is all, then, she said nonchalantly, I would be much obliged if you... And suddenly something inside me boiled over. You know what, Looney? I growled. Sometimes you're an absolute nightmare. Luna whipped her head around and stared at me, eyes wide, her helmet dropping from her grasp. Twilight clapped her hooves over her mouth, and I took a half step backwards, my mouth hanging open in horror. Great Aunt Luna, I croaked. I'm sorry I didn't... Be silent, she hissed. I closed my mouth so fast, my teeth clicked. Luna stood there, barely moving save for her expression. She swallowed several times without speaking as the muscles in her face twitched and spasmed. Half the emotions that I saw there had no names, but those that did, sorrow, rage, disgust, horror, and yes, even hatred, terrified me. Finally, after an eternity, she spoke. Princess Celestia, she said, her voice barely audible. I bowed. Yes, Your Highness? She did not acknowledge my bow. You will return to Canterlot by next train. You will not argue this point. I nodded, not even daring to glance at Twilight. From now until the gala, she continued, no trace of emotion in her voice, you shall behave yourself. If you do anything more to compromise the authority and dignity of your office, if you set one hoof out of line, I will order the guards to bar your friends from the gala and to detain you in your chambers for the duration. Finally, she met my gaze and I quailed. Is this clear? She said. I nodded again. Yes, Your Highness. This will be the last time we discuss this, she said. She continued to glare at me, and I bowed again, bowed so low my horn nearly touched the floor. It was only later, after I had cried all the tears I had left into my pillow, that I realized I had given Luna exactly what she wanted. I had promised her I would act the way she demanded, and had agreed to the punishment that she had set if I failed. That thought alone almost made me hate myself more than I already did. Well, I thought, turning over in my bed, screw her. Her and her ego. She'd got her way, but we both knew that I had won. In fact, she was probably back at her room in Ponyville right now, all alone with her ghosts bawling her eyes out. Well, I'd play her game. For sure. But only until I could find a way to make her eat her words. And for all I cared, she could just choke on those tears of hers. Memory. The day she forgot me. I trotted happily down the hall towards the throne room. I was a mess, paint all over me, though I had cleaned my hooves, but I was in a good mood. I held my gift in my mouth, a painting, for Mommy. I had hoof painted it myself, a green mountain, a smudgy yellow sun, and our palace outlined in black, me and Mommy along the bottom, and on the front I had carefully traced her name in red, CC, age 5. I knew how to say my name, but spelling it was hard. As I approached the throne room, my heart sunk. The doors were closed with guards standing outside, and I could hear voices. That meant that Mommy was busy. Maybe she had some important visitors. But then again, she was my mommy, and that meant she loved me, and always had time for me, no matter what. She'd send whoever it was away and put me on her lap and hug me tight. She'd done it before. I trotted up to the doors, then lit my horn and turned the handle. "Whoa, milady," said one of the guards, putting out an arm. "You can't go in." But I smiled my cutest smile at him, and while he was distracted, pulled open the door. I darted inside before he could grab me. The throne room was bright in the morning sun. The door stood behind the throne itself, so I could see the back of Mommy's head, and in front of her, all the ponies waiting to see her. They were all holding dresses and little cakes and one or two musical instruments. That meant it was almost time for the gala to begin. Suddenly, my mommy started to feel all funny. But I remembered I had a present for Mommy, and she'd always liked my presents, so that would make her feel better. Head held high, I trotted towards Mommy and, "Hey, sunshine," someone said as they picked me up around the middle. "What are you doing in here, huh?" I almost screamed, but I knew that voice. I looked up to see a pair of warm, brown eyes behind a pair of glasses. "Raven!" I cried, almost dropping my painting. I liked Raven. She was Mommy's secretary. She was old, like maybe 17 or 18 years old even, but she was nice. She pulled a hanky from somewhere, then wiped the streak of red paint across my nose. I giggled. "Got another painting for Mommy," I said. I lit my horn, then held it up for her. "Let me see," she said eagerly. She examined it for a moment, then turned to me with a smile. "So," she said, "that's you, but is that me?" she asked, pointing at Mommy. "No," I giggled. "That's Mommy, silly Raven." She squinted at the painting. "You're right," she said. "I am silly." She stopped walking. I looked up. I hadn't even realized we were moving. We were standing back out in the hall. I frowned. My tummy felt all funny again. Raven put me down, then crouched down so she could look at me in the eye. I looked away. "It's a very pretty painting, my lady," she said, "and I'm sure your mom will love it. Why don't you give it to her tonight?" I shook my head. "I wanted to give it to her now," I said. I stopped talking. I felt like I was going to cry. Raven frowned. "What's going on, sunshine?" I was thinking that maybe she could give it to her doctor to put on the wall." Raven cocked her head. "But she's not going to see a doctor today," she said. "Not now," I said. "But she's sick so much, and I was afraid that next time she had to see the doctor that it might not have time to make a painting for the days that she left. But I knew that if she hung my painting up next to her bed in the hospital, it would make her happy to see it. And if she was happy, then maybe she'd get better, faster. That was what I felt on the inside, but I didn't know if I could say all that, not without crying. Raven's look softened. She reached up and brushed a hair out of my face. "That's very sweet of you, sunshine, but she's not going to get to a doctor today. I know that for sure," she said, smiling. "It's not on her schedule, and she has a lot of other ponies to talk to. Besides, lots of important ponies, and though I know she wants to, I don't think she'll be able to see you just now." My tummy felt even more funny. I knew she was right, but wasn't I important too? Not even important enough for 5 minutes. Raven smiled a little, then put her hoof under my chin and lifted my gaze. "Listen, if you're a good little filly this afternoon, and do everything your full sitter says, and put on a bright smile, I'll make sure your mom will have a few minutes for you before you go to bed. I'll put it on the schedule, and everything. Promise?" "Promise." Somewhere in the back of my brain, I knew that something about this exchange was deeply wrong, that a great injustice was being inflicted on me, and that I was being asked to consent to it. All I wanted was 5 minutes, to get a hug, and to see her smile, and to give her something that I just knew was going to make her all well and better. And I was being told that Mommy didn't have time for it, for me. But if I asked nicely, and did my very best to earn it, Raven would pencil her in for a 15-minute chat over coffee, at 7:45, sandwiched between her dress fittings and a review of the menu, just like any other pony off the street. Somewhere, I knew all this, felt in my bones that it was just wrong. but I didn't have the words to express it, even the words to understand the concept, so it came out as a funny, twisty feeling in my tummy and the threatening tantrum that I knew was coming. But Raven was smiling. She was trying so hard, and I wasn't about to say no to time alone with Mommy. So, instead, I nodded. Raven sighed and smiled. She ruffled my mane a little. "That's my sunshine," she said. "Now go be a good filly and go on back to your room, okay?" "Okay," I muttered and turned and plodded back down the hall, back where I had come from. Late that night, I lay on the couch in our suite. I was still clutching at my painting, and it got all sweaty from how long I'd been holding it, but I knew Mommy would still love it. She always loved my paintings. But I'd been waiting so long. My eyelids started to droop. Just a few more minutes and Mommy would be here. Dimly, I heard the clip-clopping of hooves coming closer. That must be Mommy now. She'd pick me up and carry me to bed, and then I'd get to talk to her all by myself just like I wanted. I heard the rustling of papers, and then someone snatched my painting out of my grasp. My eyes flew open. "Blue blood! I'll give it back!" I leapt from the couch and charged after him, but he just pranced away holding my painting over his head with his magic, laughing at me over his shoulder. I chased him through the palace, but he was too fast. I skidded to a halt in one of the big hallways and stood there, my chest heaving for a while. Eventually, I looked around. I wasn't exactly sure where I was anymore. As my gaze swept the hall, I noticed a tall grandfather clock standing between two suites of armor, and suddenly, the bottom fell out of my stomach. I didn't know how to tell time yet. That's what school was for. But I knew that, when the little hand was pointing at 8, that it was time for bed. The little hand was already on 8. Just past it, actually. I swallowed. Mommy wasn't coming to see me. I knew Raven had told her about me. She liked me enough to do it, and I trusted her. But there it was, past bedtime, and Mommy hadn't come to see me. I turned and walked down the hallway looking for a landmark, or a pony who could lead me back to my room, trying to keep the tears from coming. I shouldn't be surprised, I thought to myself. I mean, it's not even the first time she's done this. And it won't be the last either. Trumpet, piano, and voice in C major. A lucky old son. I pushed open the door a few inches, then peered cautiously around it. The hall was empty. Good. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, then let out a long sigh into the silence. This hall was usually busy, but now, after dinner, but before sunset, when the palace was closing up for the night, but before all the co-workers had actually gone home, it was empty. All was quiet, the quiet of the spirits of the dead, as the weight of time. This was the memorial hall. I walked down the corridor. Luna had been making me wear my regalia, patrol, crown, and horseshoes, so I was glad the carpet was there to muffle the sound of my hoof falls. The memorial hall was a long, straight, narrow corridor connecting the palace lobby to the throne room. Both walls were filled with tall, pointed windows, with 2/3 of them filled with stained glass. I tried to avoid this hallway when I could, but sometimes I liked to come here to think, like tonight. I walked past the first window, filled with a massive stained glass image of a beautiful mare, a golden patrol around her neck, and a sun disk of yellow gold glass behind her head. There was a small plaque by her window, but I didn't need it. I knew her name and her history, hers and the 61 who followed her, just as well as I knew my own. Many of them had lived and died, largely unremarkable and barely remembered, but Equestria had been built on the backs of those mares. As I passed the big ones, the important ones, the names leapt unbidden to my mind. Helia, second princess of the sun, daughter of Solus, first princess. She held a trowel, and around her hooves stood a half-completed towers of Candlelight Palace. She'd been the first one to earn a window. After she passed, whatever memorials there were to my foremothers before her lay buried in the old castle in the woods. Celestia III, ninth princess. She held a spear and wore a helmet, and a frightened griffin cowered at her hooves. She'd driven the griffins into the mountains, and there they'd stayed ever since. Even a mention of her name was still supposed to scare them away. Celestia Hartwood, 14th Princess, one hoof on the head of a sick pony, the other holding a foal. She helped heal ponies during a time of plague, and her people loved her for it. She'd even written textbooks that were still being used in hospitals for hundreds of years later. Thea, 21st Princess. Most of the mares in the window had pale coats, but hers was a deep, vibrant red. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing the patral. Instead, she carried it in her hoof. Thea was actually a regent, waiting for her charge, an infant whose mother had died at birth, but to be old enough to wear the patral herself, she helped centralize power in Canterlot. Some suspected to legitimize her own position before being assassinated in her sleep. The murderer was never caught, but most suspected the now teenager whose throne she'd conveniently forgotten to concede had something to do with it. Noctis and Umbra, side by side, 27th and 28th princesses, the Shadow Queens. Both were armed and armored, and one of them held a sword, the other a battle axe, and the sun discs behind their heads were purple and dark. The two of them, cousins of the childless princess, both claimed the throne after her death, sparking the Shadow Wars. No one was quite sure in which order they got hold of the patral, nor which of them was the two who plunged the world into night. But someone had decided that, as princesses, they both deserved their window. I would have ejected myself, but it was far too late to argue. Celestia VI, 33rd Princess. The artist had given her a dark shadow, who most identified as her father, Prince Gladius. Though no one could prove it, rumors were that Gladius had killed Iris, 32nd Princess, and tried to take the patral for his own. The legends say that whatever magic turned ordinary mares into princesses refused to work on him. So he passed the patral onto his weak-willed daughter and turned her into his personal puppet. Starcatcher, 34th Princess and niece of Iris, carried a staff and wore a star-spangled cape. She used her magic to defeat Prince Gladius and Princess Celestia VI, then take the patral for her own. The legend goes that she was born under a special star, and was therefore fated to right the wrongs done to Equestria. But it may have been something to do with the fact that Gladius was an old stallion by that point, and Celestia VI deeply unpopular. Celestia IX, 43rd Princess, had a telescope and stood in the bow of a ship, sailed around the world twice, helping the spread Equestria influence all over the world, before ever settling down. Amethyst, 44th Princess, daughter of Celestia IX. She'd apparently taken after her father. She stood in front of a burning fireplace, a rocking chair by her side. Celestia Rue, 48th Princess. Poor dear. She carried a paintbrush and stood in a garden of flowers. She'd worn the patral for a year and a half before her mind snapped. They'd crowned her successor, her younger sister, just before throwing her in the madhouse. And then, I smiled a little. There was dear old Willow, 52nd Princess, wearing a headband and carrying a lyre. Mother of the flower children, Heliotrope, Cornflower, and Snapdragon. Princess 53, 54, and 55 respectively. By all accounts, Willow was very kind, but, well, she was more concerned with having a good time than such mundane activities as ruling. She never married, but had 5 different children by at least 3 fathers, and though she had the religious authorities frothing at the mouth, the historians had to admit that this was one of the benefits of a matriarchal succession. Since there was no question who the mother was, it followed that there was very few questions of legitimacy. Celestia Jessamine, 56th Princess, carried a book and a torch. Some called her a reformer, others a zealot, but everyone agreed she was a believer. In the wake of Willow and her daughters, Celestia Jessamine fought to redeem Canterlot's failing morals and bring us all back to the true path. She had only mixed success in the end, but still had her own fountain in downtown Canterlot, so that's something, at least. Celestia 16, 61st Princess, had some gray in her mane. She came to the throne at age 35 and had lived past 80. She wore a lab coat and carried a flask. She'd spent most of her time in the lab, discovering, inventing, or refining some great new invention. She had ruled for so long that it wasn't her daughter, but her granddaughter who took the patral after her. I swallowed, then stopped walking. After a moment, I turned to look at said granddaughter, where she stood in the next window. The last princess stood tall, proud and beautiful, her coat a soft cream, her mane a dark reddish brown. She carried an open book and quill. She nearly graduated law school by the time that the patrol fell to her, and she'd applied her lawyer's mind to her princessly duties. She'd done great things for Equestria, like simplifying and streamlining the bureaucracy and the legal code, but those had been accomplishments that didn't exactly grab headlines. That, plus the fact that she'd been sick so often, meant that she didn't really spend a lot of time in the public eye, which leads to the common, though mistaken belief that she hadn't really been much of a princess at all. And, truth be told, she wasn't that much better of a mother. I sighed. "Hey, Mom." Mom, or the glass image I'd come to think of as Mom, said nothing. "How are things?" I asked. "Same as always?" I chuckled at my own little joke, even though it hadn't been funny for at least the past 100 times or so. The window said nothing. I looked down at the carpet. Me, well, school sucks, Blue Blood's wild, Looney's awful, not much to say beyond that. I sighed. Twilight's still in Ponyville. I wish she was still here. I could really use a friendly face these days. I looked away. I'm still grounded, if that's what you'd call it, I said. Looney's watching me like a hawk, and I'm always nervous around her, waiting for her to decide on that way that I'm breathing is somehow unprincessly. I thought she was hard on me before, but now I turned and started pacing. With her, I've never known that I'm doing the right thing, I try to do what I think she wants me to, but every time it feels almost like, I gesture vaguely, like she's still judging me, even when I'm doing my best, like I'm wrong, somehow, but I can't tell how or why. I sighed, then glanced back at her. Does that make sense? Trying to do right by some pony, but every move I make it's the wrong one, and knowing that, if I made her mad enough, she's gonna... I looked back up at the window. Was that the faint hint of a smile on her face? I could never decide. I shook my head, then looked away. I feel like a prisoner, I said. I haven't spent time with my friends in 3 weeks. I haven't even seen Twilight since I left Ponyville. I can't even write her without Luna knowing. She won't let me keep parchment and quills in my room anymore. I snarled uselessly, then trailed off. After a moment, I walked back over to Mom, then looked up at her. I stood there for another moment, then chuckled a little. I said, looking away, I spend a lot of time talking to you now than I ever did back before. Well, I fluffed my wings a little. I took a deep breath and let it out. Maybe it's because you can't really get on me for talking back anymore. The window said nothing. I glanced down at the carpet again, then looked down the hall. In the light of the setting sun, my ancestors shone. Paintbrushes, axes, telescopes, and stabs glowed larger than life, where the sunset had thrown them on the carpet. How did you know? I asked quietly, looking back up at Mom. All these princesses had something to do, some war that needed fighting, some problem that needed solving. Even Willow found something to keep herself busy at least. I sighed again, but me? All I have is a creaky old nightmare of an aunt and a GPA that would scare off any college recruiter. At least, if I wasn't a princess. I glanced nervously at the window next to Mom's. My window. It was still plain glass, waiting for me to kick the bucket before they could decide what was really so great about me after all. I glanced back at Mom, then ran my hoof through my mane. I don't even know what to say. I feel like I'm doing something wrong, like I should have a war or a plague or something to fight or fix or take care of. Right now, with all the lawyers and bureaucrats and advisors, the only thing I really have to do is raise the sun in the morning, and the rest of the country pretty much takes care of itself. It's been, almost 3 weeks since Ponyville, and all I've done is school and band and study. I put a hoof to my forehead. I feel like I'm starting to go crazy, and I took a deep breath, staring into Mom's cut-glass eyes. "I feel so useless," I stammered. "All I want to do is be left alone, but I can't. I have this damn—" I tugged at the petrol. "What do I do?" I pleaded, "What sort of princess should I be?" I took a step forward and looked up desperately at my mother. "For once in my life, Mama, help me." The window said nothing. As I stared up at her, the silence in the hall grew deeper, deafening, crushing. I felt hot tears welling up in my eyes. "Nice talk, Mom," I said bitterly. I turned away and stalked back down the hall. Memory. The day I ruined everything. I plumped onto the air mattress and let out a long sigh. I pulled my party hat off and dropped it onto the floor, then sat up. I shook out my mane a little, divided it into 3 parts with my hooves, and started weaving it into a sleep braid. As I worked, my gaze slowly wandered around the tiny apartment. It was dark. Though the light of the firefly lantern we'd scrounged up cast its shadows on the ceiling, Pinky and I had got the place cleaned up pretty well, actually. Just a few cobwebby boxes left in the corner. We'd even managed to get both air mattresses in, though it was a bit of a tight fit. I mean, mine was practically up against the door, and Twilight's... I paused. Twilight sat on the edge of her air mattress, looking at the floor. She clutched her pillow to her chest, looking exhausted and miserable. She'd already taken off her glasses, but they lay haphazardly on her bags. I watched her for a little while, but she didn't move. I took a deep breath, looked away, and started braiding my mane again. "That was a fun little party," I said to break the silence. "Yeah," Twilight replied in a very small voice. "Seems like you made some friends, at least." "Yes," she said in the same tone. I shot her a glance. She still hadn't moved. "Oh, come on, lighten up a little. I thought you'd like this place." Twilight sighed. "It's nice." I glanced over my shoulder again, then turned to face her. "Come on, Twi. This is supposed to be a vacation. What's wrong?" She was silent a long while, but it was the hesitant, thoughtful silence she used when carefully putting her words in order. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet I could barely hear her, even in the silence. "I could have done without the party." "Really? I thought your friends were nice." I smiled a little, especially Pinky. She got irritating after a bit, but she was just so enthusiastic about surprising you. I trailed off, then swallowed. Watching Twi's face, this sort of talk wasn't helping. "That's not it," Twi said, quietly shaking her head a little. "Then what is?" She shook her head again. "Never mind. Just today's been..." She swallowed. "Hard. Twilight, I would like to go to bed now," she said a little louder than necessary. "We only have a few hours before the celebration after all." "Okay," I said, "just..." I reached over and dropped the shade on the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness. "Night," I said, returning to my braid. Twilight laid down, but said nothing. For a long time, there was no sound save the crickets outside. It was a beautiful summer night, warm and cloudless, the sort that would be great for roasting marshmallows. Maybe tomorrow night we could get the gang together and do some of the palace gardens. But then again, the summer sun celebration always wipes me out, so maybe... I paused, only 2/3 done with my braid. I hesitated, then went back to braiding. But then I paused again. I definitely heard something that time. I strained my ears, then slowly turned to look at the source of the sound. Twilight, lying face down, had her face buried in the pillow. Her shoulders shook, and a strangled little sob squeezed past her arms. I stared, wide-eyed. "Oh, Celestia, you complete absolute ass." I leaned forward and tried to take her into a hug, but she snarled and swatted my hoof away, then pressed her face back into the pillow. "Shut up!" She moaned, "Shut up and leave me alone. I don't want to meet any pony. I don't want to see any pony. I don't want anyone else telling me I'm crazy. I just want some quiet and some damn sleep. Is that too much to ask?" I stood. For a long time, I just watched her lying there, shaking under her blanket. Then I turned and left the room. I only had to knock twice before Pinky opened the door. "Hey, Cece," she said brightly. "Good to see you again." I rubbed my eyes sleepily. "Hey, it's not too late, is it?" "Nah, not going to bed tonight. Got too much baking to do for the celebration." "Seriously?" I said. "That must be rough." "I got coffee, and the cakes are staying up too, so I'm good." "That's nice." She leaned in on the bottom part of the half door, then looked down on the ground. "So, I'm guessing this isn't really a social visit." I shook my head. "No." "Then what can I do for you?" "How are your donuts?" "Best in Ponyville," she said, then she made a face, "but also the only ones in Ponyville." I nodded. "Point taken. How's your cupcakes then?" She brightened. "Second to none. Except maybe the Royal Kitchen's." I raised an eyebrow. That was quite an impressive claim, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. "Do you have any strawberry ones? Fresh, with chocolate frosting?" She just shook her head. "Not with chocolate," she said carefully. "How long would it take to make some? A half dozen, say. I know you're busy, but I'll pay whatever extra you want." She looked at me oddly. "Is this a cupcake emergency?" she asked, enunciating the capitals. I shook my head. "Not as such, but it is urgent." She looked careful at me for a moment. "Half an hour, quick and dirty," she said finally. "Hour and a half if you want to do the nice frosting." "Really?" I asked. She shrugged. "They gotta cool off before you can frost them properly." I thought for a moment. "Nice frosting," I said, "with sprinkles and... Can you add a card?" "Sure. What do you want it to say?" I swallowed several times before speaking. "Just..." I said finally, "Just... sorry. Sign it, Cease." She nodded. "Will do." When the alarm clock went off, I jumped. I turned and looked at the door of the apartment until the alarm clicked off. I waited, but there was no sound for several minutes. I sighed, then turned back to my reading. By the time I'd finally gotten back to the library, I had no desire to sleep, and I would have had to get up in a few hours anyway. So I found a collection of power ponies, pulled up a chair, and read by the light of a small lamp. Dr. Manhattan was halfway through explaining his plan when I finally heard Twilight stir. I heard her walk across the floor, then into the bathroom. She shut the door behind her and turned on the shower. When she shut off the water 15 minutes later, I closed the book and stood and stretched. I found the empty spot on the shelf and put back the comic, just as I'd promised Mr. Goldleaf, then walked up the stairs. Slowly I pushed the door to the apartment open and slipped inside. Twilight, her mane still damp, had already let the air out of the mattresses and had started folding up blankets. She was facing away from me, perhaps listening to the Midsummer Cricket song through the open window. I tiptoed my way over to my bag, leaning up against the wall. I fished out my bath towel, my shampoo and conditioner, my loofah, before turning and shooting another guilty look at Twi. Beside her own floor sat the pink sugar cube corner box, the lid left partway open, and pink crumbs scattered on the floor around. On top lay my card, the envelope torn open. I looked up at Twi herself, but she was still concentrating on the blanket she was folding. I smiled a little and crept to the bathroom. Nothing more was said about it. That wasn't Twilight's way. But as we made our way towards Town Hall, I noticed that she walked a little closer to me than she had on the way from the train station. And, truth be told, that was good enough for me.
A collector's dream, these books are, with high-quality art prints across the hardcover as well as in the pages. The Ministry of Image makes sure each book is crafted with care. They feature some of your favorite stories from collections such as Tales of the Sun and Tales of the Moon, to stories spanning several books such as the ever-popular Fallout Equestria, Project Horizons. Based out of Russia, they ship internationally along with a tracking number to make sure your books arrive on time and undamaged. The Ministry of Image is a passionate group of fans of the show that work closely with the fandom in order to create something special. Please visit their website, ministryofimage.net, and pick up your books today. As for the giveaway, this very book that I have been reading out of will be signed and given away once the book is completed. To enter, please join the Discord in the description and stay tuned to the info and announcements channel where the giveaway will be announced.